Hello, I'm Dr. Beth Godey.
And I'm Dr. Martha Leatherman. We're here to talk to you about home safety. This is also including safety for persons with dementia in the home. This is the first of 3 segments about this topic, and you can get all of the segments at www.mmlearn.org. Now, you really need to see the first segment first, because there are some principles we're going to cover, and the other segments will build on the principles. Don't worry, you don't need to watch them all at one sitting, but if you can watch them in order, it would be better for you. The other thing is that we think you'll get some interesting ideas from all of the segments about safety in your own home.
Now, most of us would like to stay in our home as long as possible, and I know we've found, and most of the statistics validate our thinking, that more and more people want to keep their loved one in their home, even if their loved one has Alzheimer's or another type of dementia. So these presentations are meant as a way to make your home or the home where your loved one lives more safe. Now, we're sure that you've heard all those tips and suggestions for preventing falls or reducing crime in your home, those sorts of things. But what we're going to do is we're going to show you why those tips work, and we're going to show you some unsafe situations and then do some problem solving so we can come up with some plans, and then you can also come up with some ideas for an individualized safety plan.
As you'll see on this slide, there are 3 major areas that affect a person's safety in any environment. We're going to cover 3 that are particularly applicable to aging as well as dementia. They are mobility problems, perception problems, and cognition problems. In these segments, we won't be covering all of the safety issues related to blindness or deafness, but you should check with your own local organizations about tips about those conditions. But let's talk a little bit about these 3 major areas. The first one is mobility. And when we talk about mobility problems, what we really mean is things that have to do with reduced range of motion. So, for example, you might not be able to step up over things or not raise your arms.
Right, not be able to reach something real high because you can't reach your arms over your head.
Bending can be a problem with mobility. The other thing with mobility is reduced balance and the inability to kind of hold yourself upright if the flooring is unlevel, for example.
Right, and even with walkers and canes, although they're supposed to help with balance, they can actually cause falls under some situations.
So you have to be careful about taking broad tips and applying them to every situation. You need to be thinking about your own particular situation. Finally, mobility is affected by poor reflexes, so that if someone begins to feel himself falling, he doesn't have quick enough reflexes to right himself before the fall is completed.
Which, combined with that reduced muscle weakness, really causes someone to be a high risk for falls.
So as we look through these slides coming up, and we'll show you some pictures of examples, think about how mobility would affect these situations. Now, when we talk about perception, what we're talking about is the brain's ability to sort of process the information that the eyes take in.
So even if your eyes are fine and you've been to the eye doctor and they're fine, it still doesn't mean that the brain is processing what your eyes are sending back to those areas.
Now, a common thing that people know about is depth perception. And we know that with depth perception, your eyes do work right, but you can't quite figure out how far things are away. And that happens with aging, and sometimes it will increase with aging as well.
The other thing is that when there are perception problems, visual perceptual problems, you know how you'll see an angle like this? Well, your brain may interpret it like this, or it may interpret a wavy line as something that moves.
Yes, and figure ground discrimination is similar to that, in which it's hard to tell whether two different textures, if one of them is higher than the other, or if they just look different because the textures are different.
And also figure ground means you might not be able to locate something or perceive something if there are a lot of other things around it or maybe partially covering it, like when you're looking for something on a really messy desk.
Pattern discrimination is the final part of perceptual problems we'll talk about. And that has to do with moving patterns sometimes on a rug, for example, and we'll show you a good example of that. Being able to walk straight across something even though the patterns are going in a different direction than you're walking.
Or you get two different patterns and you can't discriminate between them.
Right. Finally, the idea of cognition. Even if your brain is working well in terms of seeing things and being able to put those things in space, if you have poor judgment, you might not know not to go out the door because it goes onto a busy street, for example.
Right.
People also have trouble with memory. For example, not remembering to turn the stove off. That's the most common one.
Right. And then the other part of that is being very distractible, such that you're focused on walking down a hallway, but something catches your eye and you misstep, or you're trying to go up and down steps and you get distracted by a noise or something else and make an error in your footing.
Now, particularly with people who have dementia or Alzheimer's, impulsivity is a problem. And that is from the frontal lobes. If they see something, they might just put it in their mouth without really thinking through it, because the impulse is to put something in your mouth that you see, somewhat like a small child might do.
Right. And then there are things like poor motor programming and sequencing, meaning while, for instance, cooking a recipe and putting all the things in, or understanding that both of your hands are working at the same time to do something, buttoning or closing or locking or unlocking doors, things like that.
Well, and finally, just communication problems, reading instructions, reading warning labels,
right.
Remembering a warning about a certain situation in the house.
Now, this is a lot of information for them,
yes.
But don't worry, you don't have to memorize all these details. What you can do is you can go back to these slides and review them either during the presentation or at the end. You can do that on your computer. We're going to be talking about each one of these things as we go along, so don't worry about trying to memorize all of this. And we'll be helping you understand through our examples how each of these ways of, each of these problems can make a person unsafe.
Well, let's get started. The first thing is perhaps the most obvious, and because it's so obvious, people sometimes even forget about it. Let's look at this plug. No one would say that this is a safe plug.
Right.
But what we forget is that a lot of times older homes and homes that were built in rural areas before there were inspections and code compliances might have many of these kinds of unsafe situations. So look behind furniture, look in unused places, and check for unsafe situations that are just real obvious.
Right. Kind of do a little home inspection there to see what you can change that's really obvious.
Outlets, wall switches, those ground fault circuit interrupters, the ones that switch off if they get wet. And you might even have a code inspector come and look and see about the house if you're not aware of that.
And I think this is an example of wonderful interior design where our light switches and things are the same color as the wall, but that can be a problem. So your house may be beautifully decorated, but in terms of managing safety, it might need some changes. So for this, you might not be able to find the light switch as you're coming into the room and sort of fumbling around. And a person with perception problem would have trouble too. So we recommend one thing that's really inexpensive and easy is just to put some colored tape on it. You can change out the whole plate, but you can also just get some colored tape or tape that would be really bright, or maybe even glow-in-the-dark tape if you can find it.
They make switches that have night lights built in them, so
Right.
that you can get as expensive or low-tech as you want, but just think about it.
Now, in our segments, we're going to look at 3 areas of the house, 3 main areas. We're going to talk today about the kitchen and dining room. The next segment will be the living areas, entrances, and hallways. And then the final segment will be about the bedroom and the bathroom. And while we do this, remember, we're going to discuss those reasons why people are unsafe. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the kitchen and dining room, Martha. Oh boy,
Here's the kitchen.
Here's the kitchen. What's wrong with this picture? First of all, remember what we said about mobility. Now, you can see in this picture that it's got the wires hanging down, the cords hanging down.
Easy to catch up in or trip over.
Right. That carpeting has a little corner that's bent up so that you're more likely to catch your foot on that. There's also some food or something that's been spilled on the floor.
So you can see how mobility issues would be a big problem in a kitchen like this, with tripping over things or even bumping into that table that juts out there. If someone were to fall on the edge or the corner of that table.
Right.
Now, perceptually, we talked about figure ground discrimination.
Right.
The kitchen is so cluttered, it would be difficult to find what you were looking for if you had those kinds of problems.
Exactly right. And again, mobility, the heavy pot on the stove, there's not really any place to put it.
That's
so
right.
It's kind of difficult to figure out what you would do if you were weak and you tried to pick that up and it was hot.
And it was full of something hot,
right.
for example.
Exactly right.
Memory problems, one could sort of guess that maybe the person who lived here had some memory problems, couldn't remember to put the food items up in the refrigerator where it's a safe place.
That's right.
And if that's the case, then somebody might really have trouble remembering to turn off the stove, unplug the appliances when they're not being used, and so forth.
And the impulse to eat, and who knows if some of the food that's left out is even safe to eat. So
this is a fairly obvious example, and you might look at it and think of it through the ways that we talked about earlier and see if you can come up with any other things here that are unsafe. Let's look at the next one. Now, this is not cluttered. This has a fairly open area, but look at the stool legs there. They kind of stick out a little bit. Somebody with mobility problems could really trip on those very, very easily.
Or even somebody using a rolling walker could, the wheel could bump into that and the stool could fall over and they could fall as well.
And it's so common for us to get up off of a stool or out of a chair and not push it back in.
Right.
But this is something that could be a problem. And if somebody fell on that tile floor, and there's nothing there to catch on to either except the same rickety stool.
Right.
Let's see, what's next?
Well, now everybody has that famous towel rack in the kitchen so that the towel is real convenient. It dries out between uses, except that if you don't have anything else to grab onto if you start to fall, let's say there's water on the floor, and if you remember not being able to catch yourself.
Right, because of reflexes.
Right, poor reflexes, you may reach out for this towel holder, and it's going to come right off with your weight.
You can see it's certainly not a grab bar and not intended to be one. It's fairly flimsy if you're trying to catch your weight with it.
Right.
Well, here's one.
You know, everybody hears don't wear long sleeves when you're cooking, and you know, don't you think most people think that's like with a gas stove?
That's
because
right.
It's a flame.
That's right.
That's the only way it's a problem. Well, not so exactly.
The heat, even from an electric coil burner, is hot enough, high enough to catch certain materials on fire, especially some synthetic materials or silk. And a lot of times if you're in a bathrobe or a nightgown,
Right.
those are thin materials that can quickly catch on fire.
Right. And now look at this picture with cooking on the back burner, so that if this person has some difficulties or weakness in reaching for things, picking up that pretty big pot and moving it to the front, especially if it's full of a liquid or full of food.
So if you have cognition problems, it probably will not occur to you not to reach over to that
Right.
burner. One thing you might want to do in a situation like this is disable the back burners, so people have to cook on the front burners and are not reaching over.
Right. There are switches, in fact, that you can buy that will turn off the stove that are separate. Sometimes people will also take off the knobs that turn on the heat, so that the person isn't able to turn on the burner in an impulsive way, thinking they're going to cook and then forgetting about it.
That's right.
And covers for the burners.
Burner
There are
covers.
special burner covers that regulate the temperature.
Mhm.
We'll talk more about that later.
Okay, here is a mobility problem. You can see that it's a little throw rug. It's fairly high off the ground. It's coming up a little bit at the edge. It's easy to trip over something like that. So the mobility problem there is fairly obvious, but there's another problem.
Well, and you hear all the time, oh, take up the throw rugs, and the mobility issue is the obvious one. But the other thing is look at the pattern of this. You've got the pattern of the tile, and then this throw rug, which is a completely different pattern and colored. And so a person with perception problems may not be able to figure out what that is. They may think that it is a big step up. They may think it's a hole, or they need to step down. And even if they do try to step on it, if it's not solidly against the floor and it doesn't skid, they're likely to just fall just from stepping on it uncertainly and falling.
They might even try to step over it, which
Right.
would be also very dangerous because of the balance problems. Because just because you have perceptual problems doesn't mean you don't have balance problems as well.
Exactly.
So sometimes these problems can build one on top of the other. Here's another example of a bunch of chair and table legs as well as a patterned background. People get up out of chairs and hook their feet under them and fall quite frequently.
Right. And you hear that, well, if you have carpeting, just buy rolling chairs. But if you have balance problems or you have difficulty getting up or you need to take a lot of time to get up, those rolling chairs can slip right out from under you. Likewise, if you have carpeting like that, and you get settled with the chair, then you try and slide the chair back. It's very difficult to do it.
Right. The thing that you might look at doing in a situation like this, because we're not asking people to just replace all the furniture in their homes.
Right.
Get rid of the chairs. Move the chairs out that you don't absolutely need. The chairs that are left, make sure they're close to something where somebody can hold on when they sit down or stand up.
Exactly right.
And you might remove the carpeting so that you don't have the two different surfaces and textures there.
That's right. Perceptually, there are a lot of legs going on here, and it can be confusing for somebody. So reducing the stimulation and the clutter of the furniture is helpful.
Here's an example of where there's a visual perceptual problem. And that carpet is well affixed to the floor. The tile is stable. However, because of the different textures and patterns, somebody could have trouble negotiating that change.
At later stages in dementia, especially Alzheimer's, people will start to walk with sort of a shuffling walk. And they're fine as long as they're on that sort of slick flooring. But the minute their shoe hits the carpeting, their their foot stops, and they're more likely to lose their balance and fall. Sometimes people will get in front of a loved one like that and have them look up rather than down at the floor and guide them over the threshold, but sometimes you can't be there for every situation, so you might need to make some alterations here. But regardless, even this looks like different, it could be different heights, it could be that you're stepping into something that's really soft from a hard surface. It's very difficult for someone with perceptual problems and cognitive problems to figure this one out.
Here's another example in the kitchen where cognitive problems might be an issue. Somebody putting a hot pad on the stove, later on turning the stove on without moving it, or putting it on a stove that's already hot, so it's a fire danger.
And then the mail or whatever paper that is over there, too close to the burner so that it could really catch fire.
The other thing is that this hot pad, this oven mitt, is a similar color. If you have visual perceptual problems or failing vision, it's hard to see that that's another object. So you might go through the house and make sure that those kinds of things are contrasting colors so that people can see what's down there.
Yeah, and again, those burner covers and things like that you might want to think of.
This drawer is a clear problem for somebody with cognitive trouble.
Exactly right. Look, everything's sort of jumbled in there. And you know yourself when you're looking through a bunch of knives in a drawer, I'm sure we've all had the experience of maybe getting our finger pricked or something. You need to remove as much clutter as possible, and actually for someone with cognitive problems who may be impulsive and may pick out a knife and wanting a spoon or something, you might want to lock up sharp knives and objects, but definitely clear out and get a little bit less clutter for sure.
Think about how many utensils you really need, and clear out to the bare minimum for the jobs that you have to do. Sometimes we collect things that we use maybe once a year.
Yeah, 3 or 4 sets of measuring cups and all kinds of things, yeah.
This is under a typical sink. And if someone has cognitive problems, again, similar to a child, this could be a very dangerous situation, couldn't it?
Exactly right. These sorts of cleaning fluids, they're colorful, and we'll talk about this in another part of the house too, can be confused for other things. Spray can be confused with something to do with cleaning or deodorant. But you really need to lock this stuff up or make sure that the person can't get into the cabinet, because someone with cognitive problems, as absurd as this sounds, may actually open the ammonia, I think that's ammonia there, may open that up thinking it's bottled water.
Right, absolutely, and pour a glass, and because of slow reflexes and poor sensory perception, not being able to smell.
And those reading deficits we were talking about earlier, they're not going to check the label like we would. Likewise, medications. We've got lots of medications. We've got them all out and available and open here. Many pharmacies are now making medications for elderly people with easy open caps. Right, because of arthritis, so you can get it open.
So you can't even, if you've got somebody with dementia or cognitive problems, you can't even trust that the child-proof caps will slow them down necessarily.
Exactly right.
Medications need to be locked up and need to be dispensed by somebody who's appropriate to dispense those.
Right. Then there's wine, and wine out and available, and in glass bottles.
It's not obvious that this would be a problem, and a lot of people keep wine out just for decorative purposes.
Right.
You know, this is a decorative wine rack. But people with cognitive problems, especially if they're used to having a glass of wine at night, might forget how many they've had. Alcoholism among elderly people with cognitive problems is a big issue now. We're seeing lots more of it, not because they're drunks or because they're alcoholics, but because they forget how much that they have drunk during the day. So you should put the alcohol away as well.
Yeah, definitely do that.
Here are some helpful resources that you can look at that have some ideas and
devices.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we mentioned a few. One of the ones we didn't really talk too much about are motion detector lights, and just about all these sites you can get those sorts of things. Alarms, when someone steps on something, an alarm sounds so you know that they're getting close to a dangerous situation. But you can check out these websites and you can actually order a lot of the devices and get some tips.
That's
online.
right. Many of them have lists of things that you can check through your own home. I wanted to tell you about a couple of the devices that we have found to be really innovative. One of them is a special kind of stovetop that turns the stove off when it gets hot enough to ignite something, so that somebody with very mild cognitive problems can still keep cooking, but if they walk off and leave the stove on, it won't start a fire. It will turn off before it gets that hot.
Right. That's a really good one.
Maybe that's good for people like us who multitask. And it's easy to forget to turn off the stove.
That's true. That's true.
The other thing is special rug grips and certain kinds of towel bars that can be used for the towel bars like we saw earlier, but also are steady enough that you can grip them if you find yourself falling.
So take a look around at those resources, and in our next 2 segments we'll talk about other parts of the house. So we hope